I'd already bought my ticket, so I still have a ticket to come to Prescott on reserve, but I'm glad that I'm here, at least virtually, at the Peregrine, and it's wonderful for me to be able to celebrate the publication of these books with this group, since these books are deeply indebted to my time in Prescott. It looks like I've been incredibly prolific, suddenly having 3 books come out in 1 year, but in reality, these books are about a decade in the making. And unlike some other writers who may be serial monogamous, working on one project at a time, I tend to be a creative polygamist. I work on a lot of projects at any given time, and I see what rises to the top. And it was great to have these books come to the surface at once, and to find a publisher who was willing to do a simultaneous publication of the 3 books. It was kind of a crazy, quixotic proposal, and I was glad that he accepted it, and has been great to work with. Ice Cube Press, Steve Simpkin. I don't see him on the call here, but he's been a wonder. And if you're inclined to buy any of these books, I encourage you to do so either directly through the press, icecubepress.com, or through the Peregrine to support their work, especially during these pandemic times when small independent book sellers are struggling. What I wanted to do is tell you a little bit about each book and give you a taste of each book. Read a few poems from the collection of poems, Lost Soliloquies, an excerpt from the title story of Marrying Kind, the new collection of stories, and then read the final essay in The Art of Disobedience about my long, nearly 40-year history with Shakespeare, but particularly with Hamlet. So for some of you who maybe heard bits and pieces of this, I apologize, and maybe it'll be nice to revisit it. Or the nice thing is you can just mute yourself and hide your video and go fill up on another margarita. I will start with Lost Soliloquies, and this collection of poems. It's my first collection of poems. I've been writing poetry for a long time, and my poetry really emerges from non-poetic sources. I trained as an actor, and I taught Shakespeare for many years, and taught for almost a quarter of a century a course at Prescott College and here called Sudden Fiction, the Art of the Very Short Story, which examines stories that exist in this gray zone between fiction and poetry, the parable, jokes, soliloquies, dramatic monologues, legends, urban legends, prose poems. And so I've been working with my students as an editor as well as a fellow writer on these short compressed narratives, and a lot of my own poetry has its roots there and in the theater. The poems in this collection are primarily compressed narratives or soliloquies, dramatic monologues, spoken not in my voice, but in the voice of other characters, sometimes historical, like Clyde Barrow or Frank Lloyd Wright, sometimes fictional characters such as minor and secondary characters in Othello, and a character from Macbeth that's sort of off stage and maybe not even existent, which I'll read here in a moment. So I'm going to see if I can call up my screen. So rather than look down at the book, I'm going to just read it straight off the screen. And I'm going to start with the first poem in the book, which is dedicated to Sheila Sanderson, my longtime friend. She hired me. She was on the search committee that hired me at Prescott College. One of my favorite poets. She's here on this at this event, and this poem emerged from an email correspondence we had about a year after I moved to Iowa State, and she was in traveling in Southeast Asia, and I had just been traveling with my family to the Northeast, to Canada, to a Shakespeare festival there, and to Boston to see my son where he was attending law school. And it's called Reading the Signs. And I'm going to start with it in part because Sheila's here, and the book is informed in no small part by my admiration for her own poetry, but also from our friendship. I wonder if you're still in Vietnam and Cambodia, sweating muchly and fending off the mice that playeth about thy feet. We traveled as well to Boston for 9 days to visit our son and to trample over the stones of American history in search of fresh lemonade. Then we crossed the border to Niagara Falls with its shoddy neon splendor to the Stratford Festival in Ontario, where we saw some disappointing Shakespeare and a great Mother Courage. Now we're back in Iowa, where the thunderstorms and tornado warnings cry havoc and visitors descend on us. Everywhere I turn, there are teenage girls giggling and shrieking, but the house is big enough that I can find quieter crannies in which to curl up with books while I await the muse, which has come thus far in the form of odd profundities, half-baked theories, lost soliloquies, and promises of greater fluency, assuming I'm reading the signs rightly and not just hopefully. This next poem I want to read, I'm just going to read 3 poems from this collection, is, hold on one second. It's called Her First Husband, and there are a series of poems, as I mentioned, that are written in the voices, the first person voices of characters in Shakespeare, although in this case, it is an imaginary character. I've always been, loved Macbeth, loved teaching it, and one of the strange things about that play is that we learned that Lady Macbeth has had children before. She talks about having given suck, and she knows how tender it is to love the babe that milks her. And she says, in order to goad her husband into committing murder, that she would, while the babe was smiling in her face, pluck the nipple from its smiling gums and dash out the brains. And yet it's strange that we also hear that Macbeth doesn't have any children. In fact, he says, upon my head they placed a fruitless crown and put a barren scepter in my grip. And I've always wondered about that gap in the text, and wondered if Lady Macbeth had a first husband, and if so, what would he have to say about his former wife, her first husband? He came to me himself and told me that he loved my wife and wanted to marry her. He wanted my permission and needed me to annul her, to risk disgrace so that he could achieve his ambition. He spoke without fear of retribution. I could not hurt him, but with courtesy and respect for my predicament and appropriate shame for his betrayal. They had been lovers for months before he approached me. I had, in my way, arranged the courtship. He had not exactly been my friend, nor would I have wanted a friend for this charge, but we had been together in the field and did not, from my vantage point, harbor animosity toward one another. I could tell from the first time I saw them together, they were meant for each other. She would do him good, would uncover what lay hidden, would blow on any spark of genius, would nurture what must be nurtured and root out what impediments remained. She was a natural teacher, with a stern and exacting one. Honestly, I could never really satisfy her, certainly not since my injury. There was an insatiability about her that frightened and enthralled me. There were times in our years together when I believed her spirit would be dampened by our marriage. Yes, it is true, we had children, 3 boys, all dead by age 7. The eldest before his first year passed. She loved our sons, took seriously her role as tutor and molder of their characters, was grief-stricken, though her grief frightened me. A carapace developed around her, hardening her with each fresh tragedy. It is strange that I have outlived her. There was something mysteriously perennial about her, as if she had emerged from a planetary substance and was capable if she applied herself to it, of invulnerability. But no one remains invulnerable. I have remarried, a young, docile wife, naturally gracious, kinder, less hungry in her appetites. This suits me better. I've told myself many times, especially when the full extent of the tyranny and horror were revealed. My first wife's suicide, her second husband's head fastened, rightly so, to the end of a pike. I should feel privileged, blessed, fortunate, lucky, and I am fortunate with the trade I made in wives. But I still dream of her, my first wife. It is not uncommon, I know, for aging men who have lived multiple lives to carry in their wake the history of younger, fiercer loves. I dream about when we were happiest, after our first son was born. I remember months later, the child in the cradle beside our bed, swaddled in the softest wool, sheared from a lamb on my estate. The child waking in the middle of the night to the sounds of our lovemaking, our first encounter since his birth. And my wife, my first wife, bringing him to our bed, holding him close to her breast. I wrapped them both inside my arms, studied them, the moon streaming through the rain-smeared window as she rubbed her nipple over his smiling gums, teasing him, coaxing him. The three of us there, naked beneath the blankets. We watched our son, who would be dead within 2 months, taken by the mysterious plague that killed most of our Hamlet that spring. Watched him smile and then greedily fill himself, the thin milk from my wife's breast oozing from the side of his contented mouth. I am going to read one more poem from this collection that's more contemporary and funnier and has its roots in some of my own history. And it requires a little demonstration, which those of you who have seen me read this before know about. It's called penny snatching. And penny snatching is a trick that I was obsessed with as a child, in which you place a stack of pennies like this on top of your elbow, and then you do that, and preferably you do not drop the pennies. I'm glad that there were no windows for this to crash through. This poem has its roots in my obsession with penny snatching, but also in my fascination with secrets and secrets as a motor for plot, as well as my own family's history. My parents were great party throwers, and they would throw 3-day bacchanals in which I got to sort of prowl around the edges and sometimes perform. So penny snatching. The trouble started when my parents called me downstairs to perform tricks for their bombed friends, over for an impromptu party that began on Friday and stretched until Sunday morning. I'd been asked to do tricks before. My best one, penny snatching. My ambition, to become the Guinness Book of World Records holder for penny snatching. At the time, it was 72 pennies, attempted and caught by a Belgian Olympic weightlifter with hands rumored to be as large as a normal man's foot. My personal best thus far had been 32 pennies out of 40 attempted, but I was young and the record could be achieved assuming continued practice and a growth spurt. Go ahead and show them, my mother said. Do it for them, honey, they'll love it. My father added theatrically, it's really quite daring. I hold my breath every time he whips his arm and snatches those coins. I prepared myself, arranging stacks of pennies in 5 uniform columns on the plank of my forearm. The crowd quieted, leaned forward. I smelled the booze, the day-old perfume, the mixed nuts and stinky cheese. I held my breath, stilled myself, waiting. But this time, the pennies scattered like buckshot, rather than dropping neatly into my palm, nicking 2 people in the eye, chipping Mr. Engler's buck teeth, and hospitalizing Mrs. Brown, whose mouth was open at the time of contact, laughing at a joke. My father's lips just inches from her ear, the flirtation, the very thing that miscalibrated my concentration. So in reality, it was my father's fault, not mine. But that was our little secret. So thanks. It's odd with everything muted because I can't really hear you. I don't know if you're out there. But okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up. I'm seeing some more familiar faces. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to, I'm saying little notes that say clap, clap, clap. Thank you so much for encouraging me. I want to read a short excerpt from the title story of Marrying Kind. And this is my fourth book of fiction and my third collection of linked stories. And I love to write collections in which the stories talk to one another. Sometimes it's much more overt and the book operates like a novel. My first book, Last Call, operates this way and deals with 32 years in the life of a West Texas family that's loosely based on my own. And Love Songs for the Quarantined has some recurring characters and some mini narratives in it, but it is more thematically organized. And it's a book that people have been reaching out to me and talking to me about as of late, as you can imagine, since we're all experiencing international quarantine. Marrying Kind is a book that meditates on marriage. And I've given a lot of thought to this over the years, as I know many of you have. I've been blissfully married to my wife, Carissa, who you all know. She's on the phone somewhere here, for 36 years. But the likelihood of that successful marriage having happened to me is strange to me. It's not very likely. My mother was married 12 times, and most of those marriages were disasters, and my sort of greater extended family sort of chock full of many marriages. So I've given a lot of thought to marriage and to kindness in marriage, but the book also meditates on other kinds of marriages, on what we wed ourselves to, whether that be places. And places is a significant source of inspiration for me, as well as vocation. And there are stories in this collection that take place all over the country, many of them in the Southwest. I often find that when I move away from a place that I consider home, that's when I can write about it most fully. That's when that homesickness sort of drives me. I wasn't able really to write about Texas until I had been away from it for many years. And after spending 21 years in Arizona, where I primarily wrote about Texas, now I find myself writing more and more about Arizona, and Arizona figures prominently in a lot of these stories. I am going to read, however, the opening few pages of the title story, Marrying Kind, which resurrects some old characters of mine, essentially characters that are loosely based on my parents. And those of you who are familiar with my work, have read Last Call or The Girl from Charnel, you'll recognize these folks. It's told from the perspective in 1963 of a couple on the verge of marriage, and that couple you've seen before if you know my work, but you don't need to know my work in order to get it. Marrying Kind. Early July and too damn hot. Too damn hot even for the Texas Panhandle. The thermometer close to 95. Hotter inside because no one had opened the windows, and now the church boiled. Too damn hot to be wearing the suit of his father's, his own marrying suit, a thick black wool affair. Neil would have used the suit he'd worn to Uncle Jimmy's funeral except for his mother's superstition, her insistence that a man should never be married in a suit he'd just worn to bury a relative. His mother had taken in the back and sides since Neil was more tapered than his father Harvey Lee had been in 1940. But because she'd used Neil's skinny brother Ben as her tailor's model, she'd taken it in too much, the front buttons barely able to slide into their holes. Neil now felt straitjacketed, itchy from the starch in the shirt, sweat dribbling down his ribs, a clammy pocket of moisture between his shoulder blades. The waiting was the worst part. Stuffed in a side room, the one that led to the baptismal trough, Ben, his best man, still there with him. The music began. Laura's friend Marlene playing the old paint-chipped piano, the first of 7 songs that Laura had chosen, a Mills Brother tune, Be My Life's Companion, one of her father's favorites, which seemed ironic to Neil, given that Laura's mother had abandoned the family half a decade before, leaving Laura's father companionless. You should go, Neil said to Ben. It's almost time. In a minute. Ben flicked a piece of lint off Neil's lapel, then pulled a handkerchief from his own pocket and dabbed Neil's forehead. My God, you're sweating like a pig. Why'd it have to be so hot today? It's not that hot. You're just spooked. Neil snatched the handkerchief from Ben's hand and went to the curtain. Couldn't see much beyond the pulpit and the burnished wood of the choir banisters, but he could hear the murmurs and low-level chatter, could make out Uncle Bart's gurgling laugh, the excitement of an audience before a performance. He'd been in a Greer County Christmas pageant once, playing Herod. He felt the same pre-show jitters, the nausea and the niggling belief that this was a mistake, that he should hightail it out of there. But the show had come off well, and once Neil bellowed his first line, kill the firstborn, he felt just fine, like he often did after the first tackle in a football game. How many people do you think are here, he asked Ben. He should have known it being his wedding, but he'd let Laura handle the invitation list, and except for his small group of relatives, he had not pried too much into the details. He didn't know whether to expect an audience of 30 or 300. Laura had spent her whole life, almost 20 years in this town. Let's see. Ben climbed the 5 stairs to the top of the baptismal trough and made his way down the other side. What the hell are you doing? Neil asked. Ben poked his head back through the side curtain, his goofy-ass face above the stairs. Guess nobody's getting saved this week, he said. They've drained it. Get out of there. You're going to get me in trouble before the wedding even starts. Ben winked and then disappeared behind the curtain. Neil felt a panicky flutter in his chest, sweat beading above his lips and along his hairline. He unbuttoned his jacket so he could catch his breath and went to the bottom of the stairs, peering into the baptismal trough, painted blue with 2 small lights encased in plastic pointing up from the corners, no doubt to create a theatrical effect for the congregation, an ethereal glow for the newly saved. No water there now, though. Ben stood in the center of the trough, snorting at Neil, and put his face next to the crease in the velvet curtain. Against his will, Neil chuckled. His laughter threatened the stability of Harvey Lee's suit. The last thing he needed now was to rip the seams. Bigger crowd than I expected, Ben whispered. This is wrong, Neil said. What are they going to do, kick us out on your wedding day? Come have a look. Neil slipped off the jacket and folded it over a chair. The trough was no more than 4 feet deep, a little higher than the pulpit. The front wall made of thick glass with the velvet curtain, brocaded on the ends, draped in front. It smelled of chlorine, though that couldn't be right, could it? A secret pool for the preacher? It felt cooler down here, a breeze wafting in, but from where? He nudged Ben out of the way and peeked through the slit in the curtains, could see the audience gathered. His father, Harvey Lee, they'd always called him Harvey Lee, not father or dad or pops, with his craggy face, dressed in the black suit he wore to church, sitting in the pew, his hair greased back, making him seem forlorn. No doubt hankering as Ben had guessed for a smoke. Neil wouldn't mind a cigarette himself. Granny, Harvey Lee's mother, sitting next to him, her eyes closed, napping. Fitted into a bright green dress he'd never seen her wear before, a pinch of snuff not so secretly embedded in her lower lip. And his mother, flitting about like a blue jay, chatting up the guests. Marlene began the next song, a Nat King Cole number, Unforgettable. Ben placed his hand on Neil's shoulder. Feeling sacrilegious, he whispered. Neil smiled, started to say something, but his throat constricted. His eyes welled. He'd felt hot, itchy, and irritated until now, and was surprised by this upsurge of emotion. Uncle Bart had jokingly accused Neil just last week while they were working in Bart's carpet warehouse of being a sentimentalist, a romantic sap. That's what you are. Maybe Bart was right. He'd been prone to jarring fits of emotion lately, but Bart said that was just normal. You're about to yoke yourself to domesticity. It either makes you sappy or scares you shitless. Kickoff time, Ben said. You better get out of Jesus' bathtub. Neil closed the curtain, turned to his brother. Skinny Ben. just 18, but more mature than he himself was, probably better equipped for marriage, though Ben had never even had a girlfriend. Ben, his brother, his best friend, his best man. He reached over and bear hugged him. Ease up, Hoss, Ben said. Save it for the bride. Neil couldn't speak, his throat too constricted. Just remember to smile and say, I do, when the time comes. Neil nodded, and Ben said, good luck, and climbed up and out of the trough, leaving Neil alone. He closed his eyes and listened to the final notes of Marlene's rendition of Unforgettable, and then climbed out of the trough, squeezing back into his father's jacket, as if it were a reluctant skin. An ornate mirror hung on the wall next to the 3 white baptismal gowns to encourage a last self-examination, Neil thought, before taking the symbolic plunge. Neil had been saved himself at the Greer County First Baptist Church, but he was just a boy then, and his dunking seemed more theater than salvation. Neil straightened his tie and tucked his shirt in snugly, slid the buttons of the jacket through their holes, imagining for a moment Harvey Lee waiting 23 years ago in this very suit for Neil's mother to walk with her own father down the aisle at the church. Harvey Lee and Lynetta, both the exact age Neil was now, a startling fact no one had ever mentioned in the time leading up to the wedding. He raked a comb through his wet, dampened hair, patted down his face with his handkerchief, and then stood by the door and waited for his cue to enter the church properly and meet his bride. And then they go to Las Vegas, and it all goes to shit. So I am going to read a longer essay, the full essay, the last piece in The Art of Disobedience. And I have wanted for a long time to have some sort of record of what I've spent most of my life doing, which is teaching, teaching creative writing and literature, and to get some of my thoughts that I've been able to share with students and colleagues and have written about in various essays over the years and given lectures about form and about fiction, about the process of writing fiction, about best practice workshops for practices for workshop, but also, and perhaps most importantly, about influence, about the influences in my own life, literary and otherwise, and about the way influence figures into the life of writers idiosyncratically, not in any sort of more disciplined or scholarly way. And though I hope this book can be used for advanced undergraduate or graduate creative writing classes, and I myself am going to use it that way. It also has a lot of personal essays in it too, and so I want to read this piece that gives you my nearly 40-year history with Hamlet as a student, as a son, as a brother, as a father, as a teacher, as an actor, and other ways too. I wrote this piece as a lecture for the Spalding residency, and some of you may have seen that, but it also is indebted to the Shakespeare seminar that I taught at Prescott College for more than 20 years, and also to collaboration that I've had with some of the great students that I've had, like Marjorie Gans and Virginia Wiles, who I see right here, who wrote some great, totally inspired essays and creative pieces about Shakespeare. So it's wonderful to see so many people here who are reflected in this piece. And it also is, it has a long section that meditates on my relationship to Prescott College and just how fortunate I feel to have worked there with Sheila and Tom and Steve and Melanie, especially Melanie and Sheila. We were essentially the writing and literature program. And the great thing about working at this dinky little bohemian college is that we got to do whatever the hell we wanted and teach whatever we wanted. And what a great privilege that was. And so I got to be the Shakespeare teacher for 20 years. And that was a great joy in my life. And this piece is partly about that. And it's a little bit, it's longer. So it'll be about 25 minutes probably to read this piece. My Hamlet. I was 17 the first time I encountered Hamlet in performance. I remember late one night, all of us there, all of us from the two Amarillo High School honors classes watching the BBC version of Hamlet with Derek Jacobi as Hamlet, Claire Bloom as Gertrude, and a bushy-headed Patrick Stewart, pre-Jean-Luc Picard as Claudius. It was a warm November evening when we entered the building. And when we emerged 5 hours later, it was snowing. Mr. Huber, our charismatic English teacher, looked up and said, "It's only fitting that the seasons should change because of Hamlet." Dwight Huber loved Shakespeare, and he taught us to love him as well through his insistent questioning, his demand that we substantiate everything by specific reference to the text. He expected us to demonstrate mastery over what we had read. He forced us to think aloud on our feet and to assert what we felt and thought, and then to examine those emotions and ideas carefully, so that mysterious, transcendent epiphanies seemed to hover in the air of the classroom within our grasp. One of the great and sobering lessons I learned from Mr. Huber that year concerned Hamlet. Although he could be ruthless with his red pen, Mr. Huber was always good-humored with us in class, enthusiastically and lavishly praising our insights. "Yes, you are absolutely right, Melanie. Brilliant, Trish." And careful never to humiliate us or dismiss our half-baked ideas or show signs of exasperation, anger, or condescension. Yet early on in our discussions of Hamlet, maybe the first or second day, he grew unexpectedly upset with us. We had not read the play carefully, or were perhaps too whimsical, cracking jokes, not very eager to get down to the important business of explication, analysis, and the aesthetics of suffering. He spoke very little during our shenanigans. About midway through the class period, he said in a calm voice that I'll never forget, a voice that did not mask his contempt, "Hamlet deserves better than this." Then he sat back down at his desk and began grading papers, ignoring us until the bell rang. We were all dumbfounded. A couple of us tried to make a joke, but he did not acknowledge it, and we soon opened our books and hid ourselves in our silent explorations of the play. We were stunned and ashamed, I believe, not only because we had never seen this side of him, but also because we knew that we had let him down. We respected, indeed loved him too much. We understood that we had taken his good nature for granted, that this was personal for him. But what also surprised me then, and still resonates with me now, more than 36 years later, were his actual words. He didn't say, "I deserve better than this," or "you can do better than this." What he said was, "Hamlet deserves better than this." It was unclear whether he meant the play or the character, Hamlet or Hamlet, but either way, his anger was not about ego, his or ours, nor did he say it in a pedantic way. He was the antithesis of a pedant and could be just as ridiculous, dancing a jig, making a joke, contorting his face into a clown's mask, singing a ditty as we were. Nevertheless, Hamlet and Hamlet deserved our very best, he suggested with his comment and his icy contempt. And anything less was disrespectful, not only to ourselves and to him as our teacher, but to the experience that Shakespeare had bestowed upon us all. Mr. Huber was, in effect, defending Shakespeare's honor, defending Hamlet's honor, defending the play's honor. When we resumed our discussion the next day, we soared. It was clear we'd all gone home and immersed ourselves in the play, had made ourselves vulnerable to what both Hamlet and Hamlet had to teach us. The prince's deep ambivalence about the mandate issued by the ghost of his father, his violent disillusionment with Ophelia and his mother, and the political and emotional rottenness in Denmark, his meditations on suicide and the futility of action, his histrionic despair as he leaps into Ophelia's grave, and then the cathartic calm that descends on the play with his death, as flights of angels sing the sweet prince to his rest. We brought that experience and enthusiasm back to Mr. Huber and to each other, as if proffering a delicate gift. Looking back, I can see why Hamlet affected me so deeply then. I had the uncanny feeling that Shakespeare was talking directly to me. I had struggled with the text, which seemed dense and at times impenetrable in class and at home, but watching the play, even this flawed BBC production, the characters and stories miraculously emerged, as if from a fog-shrouded forest of language, and I suddenly saw and felt my own life refracted in it. My parents had divorced for the second and final time when I was in 5th grade. My mother had remarried not once, but 4 times while I was in middle school and high school. And the stepfathers and other men who had come into our home were often violent, and at times, it seemed to me and my sister, murderous. Like Hamlet, I secretly wondered if I was a coward, unable to adequately protect my mother and sister from the threat and trauma, desiring to escape from the chaos, especially on those occasions when my mother desperately begged me to kill 2 of her husbands. Like Hamlet, I felt miscast in and ill-equipped for a revenge tragedy. I wanted to be a courtier, a running back, a sprinter, a lawyer, a scholar, not an avenging angel, not the scourge of justice. O cursed spite that ever I was born to set it right, I knew that feeling intimately. After my mother's sister and I moved with her 5th husband to Amarillo, my father felt free to relocate to Las Vegas, where he became a ghost in the great American limbo city. We barely heard from him, much less saw him, for several years. But during my junior year in high school, I called him one winter night, desperate after yet another encounter with one of my mother's drunken lovers, and asked for his help, in fact, begged him for escape. He reluctantly invited me to live with him for the summer, a summer that shifted the course of my life. A summer I spent floating in his apartment complex pool, writing bad poetry, which I shared with his girlfriend, a dental hygienist, and reading the collected essays of Ralph Waldo Emerson. As I prepared to fly home to Texas at the end of the summer, my father and I talked about my returning to Las Vegas for college, and after that, going to law school, and then eventually joining him in his new business, perhaps as, he jokingly said, his consigliere. What that business was, I didn't really know. My father and mother had owned cosmetics and lingerie businesses. He was a successful carpet salesman for several years, and then he had somehow morphed into a con man who had once, according to family lore, tried to buy Costa Rica. He was terrified of the government and justice system. His brother was in prison for international mail fraud. My father had come to Las Vegas to seek his fortune, which he believed was just around the corner, and during the summer I spent with him, we spent a lot of time contemplating our glorious future together. During that first introduction to Hamlet, I saw all too clearly my life embodied in the young prince's dilemma. An adolescent romantically idealizing his absent father, disillusioned by his mother's or hasty marriages, and secretly afraid of being forced to do something courageous to radically change the situation. I was fortunate to have great Shakespeare teachers, not only Dwight Huber, but my undergraduate Shakespeare professor, Dr. Sharmazel Dutt, a tall, imposing woman from India with a musical accent and a booming laugh, a woman who wore a bright sari every day and expertly guided my peers and me through the Shakespearean canon in 2 courses, early plays, late plays, and presided over my first serious critical efforts, including an essay on the disease imagery in Hamlet, others on the multi-plot dynamics of the Henry IV and V plays, The Fool and Twelfth Night, and my magnum opus of undergraduate literary criticism on Shakespeare's conception of time in Macbeth and Hamlet, an essay that launched me into graduate school. I was also a theater major, working on more than 30 productions as an undergraduate, taking acting classes with a theater professor who eventually became my father-in-law, performing scenes from Hamlet, among other plays. I dreamed at that time of becoming a Shakespearean actor, or perhaps a Shakespearean scholar. But when I was 22, in my first year of graduate school studying literature, my father died of a massive heart attack on the steps of a Las Vegas hospital room. And that event altered my life. Hamlet, that play obsessed with dead fathers and grief-stricken sons, vibrated with new and painful meanings. My father's death eventually drove me away from the scholar's life. I spent my first year of doctoral studies neglecting my literature classes, taking permanent incompletes in my Chaucer and 19th century British literature seminars, immersing myself instead in the world of the theater, where my wife was pursuing her doctorate, directing and acting in plays, performing in an improvisational comedy troupe, and having a hell of a lot more fun than I was. I did 9 shows that year, including a turn as Mercutio in a post-Holocaust Romeo and Juliet, my high-water mark as a Shakespearean actor. And a glorious summer of repertory theater, and then I left my doctoral program for my first faculty position, teaching 4 sections each semester of composition and literature as a visiting instructor at the College of Charleston. The death of my father intensified my hunger to tell my own stories and the stories of my family, whose tales would be lost forever, I believed, if somebody didn't record and try to make sense of them. I yearned to do that rather than spend my life as a scholar chasing footnotes. While teaching at the College of Charleston, I started and finished my MFA, an experience that launched me into my life as a creative writer, as well as my dream job at a small iconoclastic college in Prescott, Arizona, where I got to teach pretty much whatever I wanted. A full slate of fiction writing and other creative writing courses, as well as any literature or interdisciplinary course that I thought would help me and my students become better readers and writers. Among them, literature of the American dream, the American West in film and literature, travel writing, family systems in film and literature, literature as experience, dramatic literature, and Shakespeare. The 21 years I taught at Prescott College were rich and thrilling years of my teaching life. Shakespeare was in many ways at the center of it, and Hamlet was at the heart of the Shakespeare seminar, the culminating text that we would spend a month studying. I took my students on field trips to see Shakespeare productions in Phoenix, Flagstaff, Tucson, and Sedona. I showed them many film adaptations of the plays, analyzing up to 10 different versions of individual scenes. My students wrote critical analyses and research papers, but also their own Shakespeare-inspired scenes, soliloquies, plays, stories, poems, personal essays, and songs. Every other year, when I taught the seminar, I re-immersed myself in the plays and sonnets and the long and complicated history of criticism, and in the rich theatrical and cinematic history. As I wrote my first published books, a novel and stories inspired largely by my ne'er-do-well working-class Texas family, but more influenced by Shakespeare than anyone would guess, my wife, kids, and I began to make yearly pilgrimages, 7 hours away to the Utah Shakespeare Festival, one of the great classical repertory companies in the country, a company that later won a Tony as the best regional theater. I even traveled with artistic directors and other patrons on a theater tour of Ireland and London and spent a more extended period at the Utah Festival with my wife when she was a playwright in residence and one of her plays was given an extended workshop in staged reading. At some point during this time, however, I fell out of love with Hamlet, partly because of my dissatisfaction with the cinematic and theatrical performances of the play, none of which matched the combined grandeur and intimacy of the text in my imagination. But I also became unaccountably irritated with and then bored by Shakespeare's melodrama and felt resentful of and saddened by my irritation and boredom. In fact, I developed an outright antipathy toward the tragedy. My whole course was designed with Hamlet as the culminating event, yet I dreaded teaching it. I kept thinking of this deliciously nasty poem by D.H. Lawrence, the working class skeptic, wary of the eloquent bombast of princes and kings. This is D.H. Lawrence's poem. When I read Shakespeare, I am struck with wonder that such trivial people should muse and thunder in such lovely language. Lear, the old buffer, you wonder his daughters didn't treat him rougher. The old chuff, the old chuffer. And Hamlet, how boring to live with. So mean and self-conscious, blowing and snoring, his wonderful speech is full of other folks whoring. And Macbeth and his lady, who should have been choring such suburban ambition, so messily goring old Duncan with daggers. How boring and small Shakespeare's people are, yet the language so lovely, like the dyes from gas tar. Hamlet and Hamlet, both the play and the character, seem suddenly quite stupid to me, even embarrassing. D.H. Lawrence was right. Hamlet, how boring, so mean and self-conscious, blowhard, gaseous, a case of arrested development, overly concerned with other folks whoring. Why was this Shakespeare's iconic play? You can see some of my residual antipathy represented in my churlish description for the lecture, which eventually became this essay, that I was asked to give during a residency for Spalding University's low residency MFA in writing program in 2016. Part of the city of Louisville's celebration of the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, called Will in the Ville. This was the description. Why Hamlet? It's not Shakespeare's most lyrical or perfectly constructed play. It's not as riveting as Othello or Macbeth. It doesn't have the grandeur of King Lear or the tear-jerking romance of Romeo and Juliet. The plot and characters with sibling murder, an angry, jealous ghost mandating vengeance, an offstage encounter with pirates, 8 deaths, and a baffling, brooding, inconsistent protagonist morbidly obsessed with his mother's sex life, are melodramatic and sometimes ludicrous. Unlike most of Shakespeare's plays, which he seemed to write quickly, there's evidence that Shakespeare may have written and revised his play extensively over a decade. Never quite satisfied. There are odd digressions and abrupt tonal shifts. The full-length version is overwritten and almost always radically cut for performance. The secondary characters don't have the vitality or complexity of those in Shakespeare's other great plays. So what makes Hamlet great? Why does this idiosyncratic, misshapen, weirdly personal drama continue to speak to us? In truth, I increasingly found the play to be bloated, full of histrionics and unnecessary cruelty, and a Freudian reductivism that sickened me. I felt that Shakespeare and self-proclaimed bardolaters, such as Harold Bloom, pled too much for Hamlet, who seemed increasingly like the narcissistic delinquent that Tom Stoppard depicts in his famous riff on the play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. The spirit of antipathy toward both the play and Hamlet as a character, I should mention, may have had something to do with the fact that my 4 children, especially my oldest son, Carson, sorry about this, were entering their teenage years, and I found myself saturated with adolescent angst, melancholy, mood swings, and paranoia. I empathized with the parents in the play, Claudius, Gertrude, and Polonius, even the elder Hamlet who returns to chide his procrastinating son. I still love teaching Shakespeare, but other plays seize my imagination more forcefully, especially Othello and the history plays involving Falstaff and Prince Hal. Also Twelfth Night and Romeo and Juliet, The Merchant of Venice and King Lear were naturalistic plays which benefited from excellent contemporary film and theatrical productions. I still went out of my way to see new productions of Hamlet, the David Tennant, Patrick Stewart BBC production, Jude Law on Broadway, a good production at the Stratford, Ontario Festival, another strong one at the Utah Shakespeare Festival starring its future artistic director, Brian Bond, and a national theater production with Benedict Cumberbatch. But the play no longer gripped my imagination in the same intensely personal way. I couldn't get past the artificiality of the performances, which made me cringe. Even when a performance was successful, it was invariably the secondary characters, Ophelia and Gertrude, Claudius and Polonius, Laertes the gravedigger, even the nearly invisible Fortinbras prowling around the fringes, who seemed more compelling to me. But in 2015, Hamlet re-entered my imagination with a sudden and eerily disturbing force. Several events triggered this shift in my perspective. That year, my uncle, who was like a brother to me, my best friend and best man at my wedding, my uncle brother, I sometimes called him, in a comic inversion of Hamlet's reference to Claudius as his uncle father, died of complications related to lung cancer, which had debilitated him over several years, especially after several intensive care emergencies requiring a ventilator. During this period of grief, I found myself also crippled by self-doubt about my creative abilities. A long 150,000-word novel inspired by my father's life, which I started in my early 40s, at the age he was when he died of his heart attack, had stalled. In fact, it more than stalled. I considered it a catastrophic failure, a decade-long multi-draft disaster. To fix it, I knew I would need to completely reconceive the book, perhaps start over. But was it worth it? Did I have the time or energy or clarity or will to do it? The answer, though I was terrified to admit it to myself or anyone else, seemed painfully obvious at the time. No. I'd been trying to resign myself to that failure as I turned my attention to other book projects, including collections of poetry, stories, and essays, and an ambitious set of novels set in Arizona Shakespeare Festival, another passion project I've been nursing along for several years. But still, I felt as if I had not only failed as an artist, but as if I had failed my father, or rather the promise I had made to myself when I began my writing career, that I would someday write him into the world again, tell his story so he wouldn't be consigned to oblivion. I decided to bury the book and get on with my life and turn my attention to these other more promising, less emotionally exhausting projects. But it wasn't that simple. As I tried to bury the book, my father began to haunt my dreams. I couldn't shake free of his face, so similar to mine, or his voice, or the way he cackled when he laughed, the way he twisted his hair into knots as he haggled on the phone with chumps he was trying to sell something to, the way he looked in his coffin, dressed ridiculously in a black kimono, chopsticks and his favorite coffee mug placed by his second wife, a Japanese woman, on the pillow next to his head. My father was suddenly always there in my consciousness, and at night I feared sleep. On more than one occasion, I woke at 2, 3, 4 in the morning with pinpricks of pain in my chest and left arm. Phantom pains? Warning signs? I didn't know which. I began eating Tums by the roll to fight what I tried to convince myself was simply indigestion. I'd had a scare a decade earlier, which landed me in the ER, only to discover that my phantom heart attack had been merely pepperoni pizza-induced heartburn. Melanie Bishop, who's here, came over in the middle of the night and watched our kids while Chris and I went to the hospital. Still, during this time, I couldn't stop thinking about Hamlet, especially Shakespeare's obsession with the ghost of dead fathers. I reread the play the first time in several years. The play no longer seemed ridiculous or embarrassing to me. It was instead terrifying. Although I had seen, studied, and or taught the play probably 100 times, I found myself swallowed by it anew and wanted a fresh audience of students, colleagues, fellow writers, tavern drunks, anyone who would let me tell them what I now understood about this play, as if I was the first one to discover its brilliance, its mysteriously uncanny wisdom. I wanted to explain how the play is a deep meditation on madness and suicide, on revenge and honor, on the outlandish mandates that fathers give sons. It's about brothers killing brothers, beginning before the play even opens with Claudius committing not just regicide, but fratricide against the elder Hamlet, and ending with young Hamlet killing his schoolboy brothers, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and then Hamlet and Laertes killing each other, arrows shot over the symbolic brothers' houses. I wanted to talk about ghost stories and the deconstruction of revenge strategies. I wanted to talk about the way this play, like all of Shakespeare's plays, is a secrecy plot, and how secrets always yearn for revelations, and revelations feed reckonings, and reckonings demand moral, emotional, psychological, and spiritual recalibrations. I wanted to demonstrate how the play is a treatise on espionage, on eavesdropping and spying, how it's about mildewed ears and busybodies who get themselves stabbed, about sting operations and the way indirections find directions out, and how deep plots do pall, and how these failures teach us that there's providence in the fall of a sparrow and a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. I wanted to talk about the terrible rap women get in this play, jigging and ambling and lisping, honeying and stewing over the nasty stag, too green or frail or carnal to figure out what is happening to those around them, doomed puppets for the men who control them, driven into real madness, drinking the lake water or the poisoned wine, forced to look into their grainy hearts. I want to talk about conceptual and experimental innovators, how Shakespeare is primarily a conceptual innovator, working brilliantly and fast, producing 36 plays in less than 21 years, not to mention the 150 or so sonnets and the long poems, all the while co-owning, acting in, and helping to operate a thriving theater. And yet Hamlet, as a play, appears to be the exception for Shakespeare, a case of experimental innovation. A play he may have rewritten over a 10-year period, and one that seems strangely specific and personal, especially given the deaths near the time of the first performance of his father, as well as his only son, the eerily named Hamlet. I wanted to talk about the soliloquies, about Hamlet's embassy of death, about radical excision, and how Shakespeare through Hamlet invents the human, as Harold Bloom too grandly claims, by capturing characters in the act of overhearing themselves think. I wanted in particular to talk about the to be or not to be soliloquy, and the radical difference between the quartos and the first folio, and why this contemplation of suicide has entered, rightly or wrongly, into popular culture as the most famous speech in literature. And I wanted to dissect the nunnery scene, the stunning opening of Act 3, in which Ophelia returns Hamlet's gifts, and he viciously attacks her once he realizes he is the bait to lure him into a confession about his motives. The scene, I wanted to say to anyone who would listen to me, radically upends our idea of who Hamlet is, pivots him away from the meditative paralysis of to be or not to be toward paranoia and cruelty, and metastasizes his vision of Denmark transformed from a sacred into a profane world, a transformation epitomized by the double meaning of the word nunnery as both convent and brothel, the place he consigns Ophelia. And I wanted to talk about the heartbreaking collapse of Ophelia, whose own mind is jangled out of tune by these events, turning her from sweetness and naivete to derangement, from flowers and prettiness, as her brother says, to death, sex, and the defiled body. a genuine portrait of insanity which counterpoints and gives visceral expression to Hamlet's fears about his own incipient madness. Hamlet's line near the end of the play kept floating into my head like the refrain of a song I could not stop listening to. How ill all's here about my heart, but it is no matter. I talked to my physician, who instructed me to get a stress test. I put the test off, unwilling to face the bad news or half believing that by avoiding the test, I wouldn't have to deal with the reckoning. The Christmas holidays came and the pinpricks and indigestion temporarily disappeared, or I simply refused to acknowledge their seriousness. As 2016 began, there were other stressors in my life, none more alarming than my younger sister's plight. She had suffered the most in our family, left behind while I went to college as the violence and turmoil in my mother's home worsened, and as my father resettled in Las Vegas, distanced himself from us all. My sister had dropped out of high school in 10th grade, was a mother by age 16, the same year my father died, a drug addict by 18. She'd recovered in her 20s and 30s, married a couple more times, had another child and 3 grandchildren, but now at age 47, found herself alone, uneducated, without health insurance, and with the prospect of an increasingly bleak future. She got in a car wreck, was laid off from her 14-year job as an office manager, was charged with a DUI, left her belongings in a storage locker in Tyler, Texas, and moved back to Amarillo in January, where she immediately fell into an alcoholic freefall that seemed to all of us looking helplessly on like a slow-motion suicide. By early February, she practically stopped eating, dropped to 90 pounds, but continued, we learned later, to drown herself in vodka. She began hallucinating, wielding butcher knives, became so dangerous that she could not be trusted around children, including her own grandchildren, and had to be placed nightly by her son and her childhood best friend in various homeless and women's shelters, where she went AWOL one night and had her car and most of her money, including her small severance package, stolen. I had a terrifying phone conversation with her during this time. She was hallucinating, jabbering, high as a kite, or completely crazy, or both, and the words throughout the conversation that I could not get out of my mind were Laertes' bewildered, heart-rending ones in the 4th act upon seeing his radically transformed sister, a document in madness. For several days, my family lost my sister, literally lost her, until we discovered that she had committed herself to a psychiatric hospital where she stayed, thankfully, for a week, detoxing. I found myself during this time obsessed with the circumstances surrounding my father's heart attack and his strange and harrowing funeral. I wrote and relentlessly revised during a short writing retreat in Northern California an essay about that traumatic experience, along with chapters from the failed novel about my father that I converted into freestanding short stories, Marrying Kind being one of them. Exhausted, creatively and emotionally spent, but exhilarated too by the exorcism, I sent these stories out to literary journals before leaving California. The first manuscripts I'd sent unsolicited to journals in several years. A week and a half later, near the end of March, the heart attack that I had been fearing for the last decade and had been secretly dreading for the last 6 months finally arrived. Nearly 30 years to the day of the heart attack that killed my father. I thought at first it was indigestion again. I'd just eaten a take-home dinner from my favorite Mexican food restaurant and inexplicably chased it down with 2 glasses of orange juice, a recipe for acid reflux. My wife was in Arizona visiting our friends in Prescott before heading to an academic conference in Los Angeles. 2 of my kids, neither of whom could drive, were at home with me. My oldest daughter, Vivian, was at a theater rehearsal. The pressure in my chest would not go away after 5, 10, 15 minutes. I didn't want to scare my children, Lena and Tristan, but as a precaution, I drove myself to the hospital. Halfway there, I realized my mistake. Moaning in the car, my kids on the speaker phone listening to me, I stumbled after a series of near catastrophic driving and parking errors into the ER, where they quickly conducted tests and confirmed I was indeed having a major heart attack that required immediate surgery. When I asked the nurses and doctors ringed about me if I was going to die, they all looked down or away, deliberately ignoring my question. That's when I realized the severity of my situation. They loaded me in an ambulance and raced me to Mercy Hospital in Des Moines, 35 miles away. I made my final deathbed calls to my children and wife along the way. Everything boiled down to a simple, throat-clotted, "I love you." At the hospital, a team of cackling nurses stripped me and quickly shaved my groin, and the cardiac surgeon, a man who looked like Mr. Rogers, assured me when I asked him if I was going to die that he would do his best to make sure that didn't happen. The day after my heart attack, as I recovered in the hospital's cardiac intensive care unit, my sister was transferred from the psychiatric hospital in Amarillo into a faith-based rehab program for indigent women, and began a month-long blackout period in which she was not allowed to have contact with the world. A week later, I was back at work, shaken and confused, not able to wrap my head around what had occurred to both me and my sister, our miraculous escape from the separate but simultaneous tragedies that should have claimed our lives. In the months after, during my cardiac rehab, I found myself obsessed with Hamlet. I began studying it again. I felt as I had felt more than 3 decades before when I first read and watched the play that it was speaking directly to me. To be or not to be no longer seemed like a pretty speech about existential decision-making, but rather a question that was and is still intimately and excruciatingly mine and my family's. Convalescing, I kept reading and rereading the 5th act of the play, especially the scene in the churchyard where the comedy of the gravedigger gives way to, at first, an abstract meditation on death, dead tanners and lawyers, and then to something increasingly more intimate. Alas, poor Yorick, the jester who Hamlet had played with as a boy. Until Hamlet leaps crazily with Laertes into the yawning grave where Ophelia's body lies. The speeches by the elder Hamlet's ghost no longer were artificial, lugubrious, or ridiculous. As a father of 4, I found myself needing to hear from the ghost of a father, a role Shakespeare himself played, who left the world too early, cut off even in the blossoms of his sin. I wanted to know more than ever what advice that ghost had to give to his child, and to try to ferret out what his own motives were. I now knew what it felt like to be on the other side, to be that ghost, to exist in a state of limbo, vulnerable and confused between this world and the next, too eager to rectify the world I've left or will leave behind, too anxious to warn my wife and children how they should live without me. There's a happy ending to the story. Though she still struggles with her addictions, my sister's doing better. I got to spend time with her later that October, November, our first time together since our simultaneously rock-bottom flirtations with death. A year after her entry into the program, she graduated from the nunnery, as I took to calling it, and she is in the process of reconstructing her life, dreaming now, after all these deferred decades, of going to college to become a drug and alcohol counselor, to help those who have been where she has been, to keep others from drowning as she nearly did. And I am, in many ways, healthier than I've been in a long while. I eat better, I exercise every day, I'm skinnier, I've grown my hair long, as I like to tell my wife and friends and children and students for my future Shakespearean roles. I take medication to thin my blood and keep my cholesterol and blood pressure in check. I can now joke about the heart attack with my wife, kids, and closest friends. I've been to Europe and back, including a month in London and Stratford-upon-Avon, where I co-taught with my wife a study abroad course only 3 months after my heart attack, and where we saw 15 plays, including 2 shows at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and 3 thrilling productions as a groundling of Macbeth, Midsummer Night's Dream, and an Irish-inflected Taming of the Shrew, all of us, me especially, enthralled and smiling with the light at the lip of the Globe Theater stage. On my key ring, I carry nitroglycerin for emergencies, and have only had to slip the pills under my tongue on a few occasions, including one scary evening in Paris in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, when I was mistakenly convinced again I was on the verge of another heart attack. And most importantly, I'm writing again with urgency, and for the first time in a long time, with genuine joy. I feel I can no longer indulge myself with decades-long writing projects. I'm eager to finish my work while I still have time. These are the lines from Hamlet that resonate with me most fully now. The words the mystical 5th act Hamlet tells Horatio, his confidant and friend, as he contemplates the inevitable fate that he knows awaits him. If it be not now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Since no man of body leaves knows aught, what is it to leave betimes? Let be. I have understood for a long time, as a passionate student and longtime teacher of Shakespeare, that Hamlet is literature's most famous and profound poem about death. It is the journey from to be or not to be to let be, the odyssey from anxiety and paralysis to emotional and spiritual readiness. But I didn't feel in my body or in my spirit the significance of that journey until 2016. I sensed that Hamlet, that shadow text that has hovered so close to me for my entire adult life as an ally and talisman, and for the last few years as a haunted intruder, re-entered my imagination in order to teach me how to die. I am grateful for the teaching, even if I'm not quite ready to go. The rest, for me, for all of us, is indeed only silence, but I hope not yet. When I was in Stratford-upon-Avon in 2016, not long after my heart attack, I made a special pilgrimage to Holy Trinity Church, where Shakespeare is buried. I talked another pilgrim into snapping a picture of me in front of Shakespeare's tomb. Shakespeare died 400 years ago that spring. He was, like me at the time, only 52. Thank you. I'm going to show you a couple of those pictures that I referenced. And then hopefully we can chat. Let's see. Feel free to unmute us, Susan, if you wish.
I'm working on it.
There's me with Shakespeare at the tomb, and there is me at the Globe Theater.
That's great.
Kenny, that was beautiful.
It was.
I heard you give that talk at Spalding, but you made me cry all over again. Oh, Kenny's muted now.
Well, hey, Kenny Roy, it was really wonderful to hear you reading in all three genres, you know, poetry and fiction and this essay. And I knew all of those. I didn't know the poems. Or maybe I'd heard you read them or had read through them. Of course, I knew the essay well and that story quite well. But I think one of the measures of really, really fine writing is to hear it again and to hear it again or to read it again and to keep having it sort of touch you in different ways. And it surely did. And I really appreciate that a great deal.
Roy. Well, I'm happy to chat with anyone who wants to stay on and chat. It's so good to see all of you. If you have to run, I totally understand that too. I appreciate you being here, but I'm happy to chat about books or any of these pieces I read or your role in them.
Well, I'm loving it. I think it's wonderful. And what's happening with that book now?
The Art of Disobedience was just published, not just a couple of months ago, and it was supposed to be ready in time for the trip in late March.
You can, if you, you can exit.
It came out a little bit
full screen.
A little bit later. Looks like someone maybe needs to mute. Kathy maybe needs to.
Kathy, mute. Okay.
And right now, I'm putting a virtual tour. This is the first of I hope many, and doing some radio interviews, and going to contact some writing teachers and editors of literary journals and podcast producers and hosts. They're interested in reading it or adopting it for the classes or reviewing it. I want to get the word out about that book, but also all of the books. It's strange publishing now because we're having to figure out new ways of promoting the work. But I'm also excited about that prospect as well.
Yes. Well, it's wonderful. I love it. And I'm sure I'm going to love it with every essay, but I don't think one could be more powerful or more intimate or more you than that particular essay. Congratulations on that.
Well, thank you.
More
Anybody
comments?
Comments or questions?
Maybe people, I've got people, I'm asking them to, it wants me to ask them. So maybe they're trying to talk and can't.
Kenny, this
Yes.
is Walt.
Hey, Walt.
Just loved hearing you read, and missed you so much, you and Carissa, so for all these years, and really glad. I was really hoping to see you in person, but this is second best, but it's really wonderful. And I didn't know about your heart attack, so I'm so glad that you recovered from that and that you're going strong. And leaving Prescott College has certainly been a wonderful thing for me. I'm resuming my wildlife art career, and it's really taken off. So it's something I couldn't do. For 27 years, I put my painting aside, and now I'm painting again. What's your email?
My email is, if you go to my website, it's klcook.com or .net, and klcook@klcook.net. You can get me there. Or kennyleecook@gmail.com or klcook. So there's lots of ways of getting a hold of me. But if you just Google my name, my website will come up, and you should be able to get to me.
Perfect. Thanks.
It's great to see you, Walt. Walt and I taught together for more than 2 decades, and he's a wonderful naturalist and ecologist, but also was our sort of adopted interpreting nature through art and photography teacher for many years. A popular class, as you can imagine, at Prescott College.
Yeah, it's really great to be getting back to the art.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
So, Kenny, I don't know, you're not showing up on our screen. Let me change settings here.
If I speak, it'll probably I'll show up.
There you are. There you are. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how it got by me, your falling out with Hamlet, because we were together, we were debating what year that was before you actually revealed the timing. And I've heard part of this essay, but not the entirety, and look forward to, we did give Claire this book, who's studying writing, as you know, and she's very psyched about it. But this was super inspiring. And tonight, just hearing you read, Wayne and Kenny and I have been on many writing retreats, and part of that exercise is to read or talk about the work that happened during the day. And hearing Kenny just read, I saw many of us closing our eyes and just leaving our lives in going there. And that last essay in particular, Kenny, was just brilliant. So thank you. Thank you, Kenny.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. Tim and Wayne and I have gone on a writing retreat. I think every year, at least once a year, for about 20 years now. Tim is an agroecologist and works at the Land Institute, and Wayne is a family systems theorist and therapist, was my former dean, and they've inspired my work as much as anybody in my life, and families are sort of dear extensions of my own family. And one of the ironies is that Tim and Sarah's daughter is now in an MFA program studying fiction at Brown, and my daughter is in a stable program at Iowa State. So we've exchanged children.
Love those family systems.
Switcheroo.
Anyone else have some questions? Or just want to chat with him?
Okay, I'll ask you a question. This is really about working in different genres. You know, for those of us who write in different genres and also teach, and I see some people here I've worked with in teaching, and Kenny and I know him originally through the Spalding Low Residency MFA program, and then now as a friend for many years. You know, sometimes writers struggle, like, should this be a work of fiction? Should it be a work of nonfiction? Am I a creative nonfiction writer, or am I a poet? Am I, you know, an essayist? Am I a short story writer? And are these sorts of, and not false distinctions in terms of the genres, but do you find more often that, you know, are you unusual, do you feel, in this facility to write in different forms and different genres? Or is it something that you encourage all writers to try as they're sort of coming up the way?
Oh, that's a great question. And Roy and I have worked for many years, as he said, at Spalding. He's a wonderful novelist as well as a journalist who's publishes frequently in the New York Times. And he and Elaine Orr, who is also a multi-genre writer and teaches as a professor at North Carolina State, they wrote beautiful blurbs for me for this book. I embrace the sort of multi-genre approach, and we do at our program too, even though students have to be admitted in one genre at Iowa State University. We allow them to genre hop as soon as they get here, and we believe that over the course of a life in letters, you're gonna work in many different genres. That certain subject matter will lend itself to a certain form or genre in a way that other subject matters don't. And sometimes you want the mask of fiction. You want to talk in other characters' voices and be a chameleon or a ventriloquist and hide behind that mask. And other times you just want to tell it straight. And I've always been inspired by Melanie Bishop, who trained as a fiction writer, but really came into her own as a memoirist and memoir mentor to so many of our students. And I was always fascinated by her ability to sort of navigate what needs to be memoir, what needs to be spoken without the mask, and what should be spoken with the mask. And just, I think the writers I most admire are the ones who more freely move between multiple genres. I just think that that's natural over a long life in letters, and also move into other creative arts. Terry Price is on here. He's an amazing photographer, and I think that is what's giving him a lot of juice right now. And even though he's a wonderful writer, and I know that the two sync together.
Anyone else?
I just want to say hi, Kenny, after all these years, and also to you, Roy. I was lucky enough to be a student of both of them at Spalding. So, but I was so excited and surprised when I got your email that you sent out about the event, and I'm so glad you did, so that I could catch this and be part of it. I really loved the essay, especially, but also enjoyed the hearing. So I don't think I knew that you were kind of multi-genre to that degree, and I love the poetry as well. So I just wanted to say hi and thanks.
Thank you, Grace, and thanks for coming. I'm looking forward to catching up more.
Yeah.
Been in touch in a while, and saw you on my contact list, and I was hoping it would reach you. I'm glad it did.
Yes, well, I'm so glad. Thanks so much for adding me.
You bet. Well, anybody else want to chat or ask a question? Or? Well, I want to thank you so much, all of you, for coming, for listening to me, and allowing me to share this work. It's kind of odd to have really the most significant publishing year of your life, and then to suddenly just be locked in quarantine. It's been kind of bewildering, that kind of silence. So it's wonderful to be able to share the work, especially with all of you who represent so many different parts of my life. Prescott, Spalding, Iowa. It's just great.
And I like to say, get those books, because you won't regret it. Every one has gorgeous word, just perfect, so perfect. I couldn't even begin to do a decent review in 300 words of 3 books, 3 wonderful books. So thank you for them. And if you don't have them, we'll have them. Or where else did you say besides Peregrine?
If you just go to my website,
Ice Cube is great. They're great people.
You'll see purchasing options from both places, and certainly getting it from Peregrine would be great too. And anything you can do to buy the books, not just to support me, but really to support small bookstores and independent publishers who need all the support they can get. My publisher invested a great deal in me, and the pandemic has not paid him back yet. So I'm eager to help him more than I am to make money myself. But I'm also just eager to share the work. I'm proud of the work and excited to have it in the world. So thank you all so much.
Get them somewhere. Thank you.
And feel free to reach out to me by email or phone. I'd love to chat with you, and it's just wonderful to see your faces. And thank you for spending part of your Thursday evening with me, wherever you happen to be. You're all over the country. It's great. Bye-bye.